And realize that for your exams, your tests next week and the following week, you're not getting reading time.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine, ma'am, but just like starting at the right time and like.
You know what? We'll organise for some woman to do it.
Thank you, ma'am.
Is it women do it?
I think it'll be done.
For the test next week, like
Lorenzo
wants a class.
Your Miss France is a Jerusalem woman.
Here we go.
Ma'am, it's so cool.
Oh, rubbish. Okay. So, Isabella, what's your job in life?
That's why I'm standing, but I'm so cool.
Okay. So, grade 11, choice 2. It's okay. I will do it.
It's recording.
I know. But you've got to say the thing.
Grade 11, choice 2. First half hour. Action.
Where's the action? I said action.
She's too cold to take her hands off. Okay. All right.
Half of my feet here. Half of my feet. And now leave the door open.
Okay. How are you doing in terms of the brain? Okay. Did you have any problems yesterday when you went home and learned the work? Because I know that you did, because that's what I told you at the beginning of the year I expect you to do. Okay, let's try that one again, because I didn't get any answers at that point. Erin.
Definitely, ma'am, it was amazing.
I said, did you have any problems? And you said definitely.
Oh, no.
No, learning it was good. Yesterday I was crying because we had an essay to do today, ma'am.
Well, you kids leave everything to the last minute. It's not my fault. Okay. All right, so we'll go back and look at these things again. So remember that there's grey matter on the outside of the brain and white matter on the inside of the brain. But the spinal cord, that is reversed. So in the spinal cord, and we will deal with the spinal cord later, the inside is grey matter and the outside is white matter. Okay, and then remember that grey matter contains lots of cell bodies, and cell bodies have got little granules in them. And that's mainly why it appears grey. Whereas white matter is the axons of neurons, and those axons are surrounded by myelin sheaths, and myelin sheaths are fatty because they're cell membranes, and cell membranes are made mainly of phospholipids, and therefore they're fatty, and therefore they appear white in colour. Okay, all right, you happy with that? Does that make sense? All right. So then we spoke about this part of the forebrain is called the cerebrum, and it's the biggest part of the brain. It's about 75% of the total volume of the brain, and it is divided by a very deep fissure that runs longitudinally into a left and a right cerebral hemisphere. All right, which cerebral hemisphere is this one, Erin? Well, if I glare at you for long enough, you'll realise that the only other option is the left.
No, I was talking it because of like the left and right side of the body, and then.
Okay, so remember that this individual is facing this way because there's the cerebellum, and remember that the cerebellum is tucked in underneath, and there's the spinal cord, and so this cerebral hemisphere, left cerebral hemisphere. Okay, right, you happy with that? Okay. Then I said to you that the cerebral hemispheres are partly connected to each other by means of a mass of white fibers. And again, if they're white fibers, remember that means that they're axons of neurons. And those ones are neurons which lie across, and therefore they are connecting the left and the right cerebral hemispheres of the brain. Okay. And that structure is called the corpus callosum, and it's a very tough band of white tissue. Okay. And then I spoke about the ventricles that are within the brain. So remember, those are little cavities that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. There are two that are called lateral, or 1 and 2, and they're in the cerebrum. They're connected by a tiny little canal to a third one in the middle, which is connected by a tiny little canal to a fourth one, which is closer towards the spinal cord. And then remember that the fourth one is connected to the central canal, which goes all the way down the center of the spinal cord. So if you look at the spinal cord, it doesn't show on this, but in fact, all the way down the spinal cord, there's a little central canal, and that central canal is continuous with the fourth ventricle in the brain, and therefore that cerebrospinal fluid is continuous all the way. Okay, right, you happy? And then the surface of the cortex is very folded, forming many fissures. Be careful how you spell those. Okay, so you can see clearly here, grey matter, white matter, corpus callosum. Okay, and then there are the two lateral ventricles, ventricles 1 and 2. Okay, and you can see the deep longitudinal fissure. Okay. Right, then I spoke about the fact that the different parts of the cerebrum are named the same names as the bones of the cranium underneath which they lie. So remember that this brain is of an individual that's facing in this direction, because here's the cerebellum, and remember the cerebellum is tucked in underneath here. And so this part here is called the frontal lobe. Okay? This part here is called the parietal lobe. This part here is called the temporal lobe, and that part is the occipital lobe. Because the bones of the cranium are named exactly the same names. So, frontal bone, you learned in grade 10. Parietal bone, there are 2 of them. Temporal bone, and occipital bone at the back here. Okay.
We just learned skull.
Okay, read my lips. Frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. Okay, all right. You okay with that? Do you need me to write parietal and occipital on the board?
Sorry! Can I see? Sorry! Thank you, ma'am. All I hear is this, read my lips, and then I see nothing, and I'm like, great.
Here we are, my little pookum schnookum. Okay, right. Here's the frontal. See the sutures? So this is the frontal. The parietal, there are 2 of them, from there to there. Okay, and from there to there. And then you can see the joints here. This part is the temporal, as in temple.
Ma'am! I don't know how to break this to you, but the camera only stops like halfway down the screen of the background, so I just see hands moving.
She can't see the skull, but that's good.
Come to school.
Thank you, ma'am. That's perfect. That's perfect.
Frontal. Somehow deja vu, like I've done this just a minute ago. Okay, parietal. Okay, can you see where the sutures are there? Okay, everything above that, that's parietal, from there to there. Okay, this is temporal, as in temple. I'll write it on the board. And then see the suture here and here. This is occipital. I'll write it on the board.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mute your microphone.
Hi, Tony. Hi, Tony.
I think they miss you. Either that or they're just being disruptive. Okay. So frontal. Can you see this, Tony?
Yes, ma'am. Perfect. Thank you, ma'am.
one on?
Ma'am, am I on like an iPad stand or am I like on a laptop?
You're on a laptop.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. I was wondering, I was like, what?
Okay, right, so frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital. So frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. And those different lobes have got different functions. Okay, Tony, can you see the screen?
Yes, perfect. I can see the little colors.
Okay.
Perfect, ma'am. Thank you.
All right, so there you can see frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. And the different regions have got totally different functions. So remember that the way that they are able to, Vashani, tell the function of something is they look at an individual who's got that part damaged, they see what that individual can't do, and then they know that that region performs this particular function. So the frontal lobe is the most important part. Well, they're all important, but the frontal lobe is the one that does all the higher order thinking skills. Reasoning, judgment, willpower, all those functions that are considered very high in terms of that an individual is, that a human is better than, say, an ape. Because an ape can't do X, Y, and Z, that a human is considered more developed, more evolved than an ape, because the human can do X, Y, and Z. Almost all of those very high order functions are located in the frontal lobe, and in evolutionary terms, that is why the frontal lobe is bigger in evolutionary terms as you go through the hominids. So next year when you deal with evolution, you're going to learn about the evolution of hominids, which is the individuals in evolutionary terms leading up to the evolution of man. And it starts with things like Australopithecus, and then Homo erectus, and then different various Homo of various types, and then Homo sapiens, which is humans. And what you can see as you go up that group of individuals is that the frontal lobe becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you look at individuals like Homo erectus and you look at the cranium, first of all, the cranium obviously shows you the size of the brain. You realize that. So where they've found fossil skulls, they are able to determine the size of the brain by, for example, plugging up all the holes, and there are holes because they're nerves which come out those various holes. So if they find a fossil skull, they would need to plug up all the holes, and then what they would do is, for example, pour sand into here and pull the sand out into a measuring cylinder, and then be able to say, okay, this individual's brain was, say, 500 cubic centimeters, okay, or 500 moles big. So in evolutionary terms, they are able to compare the size, the volume of the brain as one progresses up an evolutionary scale. However, the other really important thing is not just the size of the brain, because obviously an elephant has a bigger brain than a human, because an elephant's bigger than a human, okay? Doesn't mean necessarily that an elephant is more intelligent than a human is, okay? But what is important is which part of the brain has developed most in evolutionary terms as you go to Homo sapiens. And what you will see is Homo sapiens is the organism that has a most, of all of the hominids, the most vertical frontal bone. Okay, so it sort of almost goes almost straight up. That means that the frontal lobe is very big, and that means that a human is able to do certain of the functions that are determined by the frontal lobe, which the organisms further down in the scale cannot do as effectively. Does that make sense, guys? So if you look and you compare this with, say, Homo erectus skull and Australopithecus africanus skull and Australopithecus afarensis skull, the shape of the frontal lobe has become more and more pronounced as you go up to Homo sapiens. Yes. And what they talk about is less sloping. So if the frontal bone lies like that, then the frontal lobe is not very big. If the frontal bone lies like that, then there's more space for the frontal lobe, and therefore it's evidence that the frontal lobe is better developed. And the bigger the frontal lobe, the more able that individual is to be able to do, that's terrible English, more able, whatever, better able to do those things. Okay, right, happy. You are ghastly.
Ma'am, it's so cold.
Tony, we miss you. This class is ghastly without you.
Thank you, ma'am. I miss everyone too. And I could just see, ma'am, when you started the recording, Izzy, I could just picture her doing that slap camera film thing. When you were like, time to record. And I could just hear, ma'am, it's so fun.
It's not. It's boring and it's quiet. We need you back. But I never thought I'd live to say that, but I do.
I'll be there Monday, ma'am.
Yay. Okay.
Hey.
All right. So the frontal lobe is involved in, and when I say involved in, I mean it's where these processes occur. Reasoning, motor control. And motor means movement. So this is where movement is initiated. Okay, so if I decide I'm going to walk in that direction, that comes from the frontal lobe. Okay. Emotions, language. It contains what is called the motor cortex, and I'll show that to you just now, which is involved in planning and coordinating movement. So this is where movement is planned, this is where movement, to a certain extent, different parts of the body are coordinated, but the cerebellum is very important in that, and we'll talk about that later on. And then what is called the prefrontal cortex, which means right at the front. And cortex, I told you yesterday, is the outermost grey layer. Okay? And this is responsible for what are called higher level cognitive functioning. And you know that cognitive means thinking. Okay? So these are the very high level thought processes. They're sort of it would be really nice if I could shoot that person who annoys me, but I actually can't afford to spend the next 20 years in jail because I have 2 children that I have to look after. So all that kind of logical reasoning and rationale, that's done by the prefrontal cortex. It's also the area which is essential for language production. So there are a number of different ways in which paleontologists can tell if they get a skull. They can say, this individual didn't speak, or this species did speak. And one of them is to do with the structure of the prefrontal cortex, and the other is to do with the shape of the jaw. Because we've got speech, we've got a little protruding jaw. See this bone here? Sticks out? My chin. Okay, so if you look at all the organisms before this on the evolutionary scale, the chin slopes backwards. And if the chin slopes backwards, there's less space for the tongue. And if there's less space for the tongue can't make sounds, make word sounds. Okay. Right, Tiny, we've got to cut for a moment because we need to make a projector.
Okay,
No, don't go.
Oh, it's on the little camera thing. Oh, okay.
Yes.
End of the first half hour. Grade 11, choice 2.